The blood-red sun slipped behind the jagged rim of Rattlesnake Canyon as Lillian Warren stumbled over loose stones, one hand clutching her swollen belly, the other braced against the rough canyon wall. 6 months pregnant and alone in the wilderness of 1878 Arizona territory, she had never felt more terrified or more determined to survive. "Keep moving," Lillian whispered to herself, wincing as another sharp pain shot through her lower back. She couldn't afford to rest, not with Vernon's men likely still pursuing her. 3 days she'd been running since escaping the hellish nightmare her life had become. 3 days of hiding, scavenging, and pushing forward with nothing but raw instinct driving her onward. The sound of hoofbeats echoed through the canyon, bouncing off the towering walls and making it impossible to determine their direction. Lillian froze, pressing herself against the rust-colored rock face, her heart hammering against her ribs. The baby kicked vigorously, as if sensing her terror. "Shh, little one," she murmured, placing a protective hand over her middle. "We'll be safe soon." The words rang hollow even to her own ears. Where could safety possibly be found in this unforgiving landscape? The hoofbeats grew louder, and Lillian frantically scanned her surroundings for somewhere to hide. The narrow canyon path offered little cover, just scrubby brush and a few boulder outcroppings. She darted behind the largest rock formation she could find, crouching low and fighting to control her labored breathing. The rider approached slowly, his horse's hooves crunching on the loose gravel. Lillian could hear the creak of saddle leather now, so close that discovery seemed inevitable. She closed her eyes, silently praying that this wouldn't be the end of her journey, of her baby's chance at life. "Madam, I know you're there. I ain't looking to hurt you." The voice was deep but gentle, lacking the harsh edge that characterized Vernon's men. Still, Lillian remained hidden, unwilling to risk her safety on a stranger's word. "I seen you running from those men back at Calico Springs. Been tracking you since. Not to harm you, madam, but to help. You're heading into a dead end. There's only one safe path through these canyons, and it ain't the one you're on." Lillian's throat tightened. She needed help desperately, but trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. "How do I know you're not working for Vernon Blackstone?" she called out, her voice cracking with fear and dehydration. There was a pause, then the sound of boots hitting the ground as the rider dismounted. "Don't know no Vernon, madam. I'm Miles Fletcher, ranch hand at the Triple Crown outside of Holbrook. I was delivering horses when I saw those men chasing after a woman. Didn't seem right." His voice moved closer, slow and cautious. "I can guide you through these canyons to safety, but we need to move quick. Sun's setting, and these passages get dangerous after dark." Lillian peered around the edge of the boulder. The man stood about 15 feet away, hands held open at his sides in a non-threatening gesture. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could make out a strong jawline covered in several days' worth of stubble. He wore the practical garb of a working cowboy, worn denim, leather vest, and scuffed boots, not the flashy attire of Vernon's hired guns. "Why would you help me?" Lillian asked, still not emerging from her hiding place. "My mama raised me to help folks in trouble," he answered simply. "And begging your pardon, madam, but you look to be in a fair amount of it." His eyes dropped briefly to her swollen abdomen, and something like respect mixed with concern crossed his features. "That baby deserves a fighting chance, same as you." Another wave of pain gripped Lillian, sharper this time, forcing a gasp from her lips. She leaned heavily against the rock, momentarily dizzy. Miles took a step forward, then stopped when she shrank back. "Listen, madam, those men, they're still searching. I crossed their trail about 3 miles back. They know these canyons better than you do. But I know them better still. Been riding through here since I was a boy." The fading light cast long shadows across the canyon floor. Lillian knew she was running out of options. If night fell before she found shelter, the dangers would multiply: predators, exposure, treacherous footing in the darkness. And if Vernon's men caught up to her? "All right," she finally said, stepping out from behind the boulder. "I'll go with you, Mr. Fletcher. But I warn you, if this is some kind of trick—" "No tricks," Miles assured her, keeping his distance to avoid frightening her further. "Just a helping hand. And it's just Miles, madam. Never been much for formalities." "Lillian," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Lillian Warren." Miles nodded respectfully, then gestured toward a chestnut mare tethered a few yards away. "Let me help you up on Penny here. She's gentle as they come. We need to move quick if we're going to make it to the safe passage before full dark." Lillian approached the horse warily. The animal snorted softly, large brown eyes regarding her with calm curiosity. Miles cupped his hands to give her a boost, and after a moment's hesitation, Lillian placed her foot in his palms, allowing him to help her onto the saddle. Once she was seated, Miles gathered the reins and began leading the mare along a barely visible trail that branched away from the main canyon path. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone intimately familiar with the terrain, occasionally glancing back to check on Lillian. "How far along are you?" he asked after they'd traveled in silence for several minutes. 6 months, Lillian answered, one hand protectively covering her belly. Miles nodded without turning. "My sister just had her third. Strong woman like you seem to be." The simple compliment caught Lillian off guard. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with respect rather than ownership or disdain. "Those men," Miles continued, carefully picking their way around a fallen boulder, "they your husbands?" "No," Lillian said sharply, then softened her tone. "I'm a widow, or I was. Those men work for Vernon Blackstone. He owns half the businesses in Calico Springs, including the boarding house where I was staying." Miles didn't press for more details, for which Lillian was grateful. When she'd refused, he'd locked her in a storage room, declaring his intention to break her spirit, until she consented. After 3 days of captivity, she'd managed to escape through a window, fleeing with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate plan to reach the nearest town large enough to lose herself in. The canyon narrowed as they continued, the walls rising steeply on either side. The last of the daylight faded, leaving them in a blue-gray twilight. Miles produced a small lantern from his saddlebag and lit it, the flame casting eerie shadows on the rock walls. "Not much further to the passage," he said, his voice hushed. "Once we're through, we'll make camp for the night. You need rest." As if in response to his words, another pain seized Lillian, stronger than the previous ones. She gasped, clutching the saddle horn to keep from falling. Miles was at her side instantly. "What is it, the baby?" Lillian nodded, breathing through clenched teeth until the pain subsided. "Just pains. I've been having them on and off. The doctor in Calico Springs said it was normal, my body practicing for the real thing." Miles looked unconvinced but didn't argue. "All the more reason to get you somewhere safe to rest. Can you hold on a bit longer?" "I've made it this far, haven't I?" Lillian managed a weak smile. They continued in silence, the only sounds the soft clopping of the horse's hooves and the occasional cry of a night bird. The canyon seemed to close in around them, the walls drawing nearer until they were barely 10 feet apart. Lillian fought against a rising sense of claustrophobia. "Here we are," Miles said finally, stopping before what appeared to be a solid wall of rock. "The safe passage." Lillian frowned, looking around in confusion. "I don't see any passage." Miles smiled and held the lantern higher, illuminating a narrow fissure in the rock face that would have been invisible in the growing darkness. Most folks ride right past it. That's what makes it safe. He secured the lantern to the saddle and led the horse toward the opening. We'll need to go single file. I'll lead Penny. You just hold on tight. The passage was so narrow that Lillian's legs occasionally brushed against the rock walls. She ducked her head to avoid low-hanging outcroppings, trusting Miles to guide them safely through. The air grew cooler and danker the deeper they went, smelling of wet stone and mineral deposits. Just when Lillian began to wonder if they were traveling through a mountain rather than a canyon, the passage widened abruptly, opening into a small, sheltered valley. The night sky spread above them, a vast canvas of stars uncountable in their brilliance. A small stream trickled nearby, and grassy patches dotted the otherwise rocky ground. "Valley of Shadows, the Navajo call it," Miles said, helping Lillian down from the horse. "Hidden from all sides. We'll be safe here tonight." Lillian's legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground, stiff from riding and weak from days of inadequate food and rest. Miles caught her elbow, steadying her without comment. "Can you stand while I set up camp?" he asked. Lillian nodded, determined not to appear any weaker than necessary. She watched as Miles efficiently unsaddled the horse, laid out bedrolls, and gathered brush for a small fire. His movements were practiced and economical, speaking of years spent in the wilderness. Once the fire was crackling softly, Miles rummaged in his saddlebags and produced some jerky, hardtack, and a canteen of water. He offered them to Lillian first. "It's not much," he apologized. "Wasn't planning on company when I set out this morning." Lillian accepted the simple fare gratefully. "It's more than I've had in days," she admitted, taking small, careful bites of the jerky to make it last. The baby kicked vigorously as she ate, as if offering thanks for the nourishment. "Tomorrow we'll reach my cabin," Miles said, settling across the fire from her. "It's about half a day's ride from here, tucked away where those men won't think to look. You can rest there while we figure out what to do next." "Your cabin?" Lillian questioned. "I thought you worked at the Triple Crown Ranch." "I do," Miles confirmed, "but I've got my own place too. Small spread, just enough for me and a few head of cattle. Been building it up for 5 years now." Lillian studied his face in the firelight. Miles appeared to be in his early 30s, with deep-set eyes that reflected the flames. Weather and work had carved lines at their corners and across his brow, but there was a gentleness to his features that belied the rugged exterior. "Why would you risk so much for a stranger?" she asked softly. Miles poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. "Like I said, my mama raised me right, and—" He hesitated. "I had a sister, younger than me by 6 years, got herself in trouble some years back. Man who did it cast her aside. She tried to make it on her own, but—" His voice trailed off, the pain of old memories etched clearly on his face. "I'm sorry," Lillian whispered. Miles nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy without meeting her eyes. "Been too late to help her for a long time now, but I'm not too late to help you." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, filled with a quiet determination that comforted Lillian more than flowery promises could have. This man, she sensed, was one who kept his word. As the night deepened, Lillian's exhaustion caught up with her. Her eyelids grew heavy, and she found herself struggling to stay awake. "Rest," Miles encouraged, noticing her fatigue. "I'll keep watch." Too tired to argue, Lillian eased herself onto the bedroll he'd prepared for her. The ground was hard beneath the thin blanket, but after days of running, any chance to lie down felt luxurious. The baby settled within her, as if also appreciating the opportunity to rest. "Thank you," she murmured as sleep began to claim her. "For finding me." Miles's reply, if he made one, was lost as Lillian surrendered to exhaustion. She woke with a start sometime in the deepest part of night. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to make out the rocky walls of the small valley. Across the dying flames, Miles sat with his back against a boulder, rifle across his lap, head tilted slightly as he listened to the night sounds. Sensing her gaze, he turned toward her. "All quiet," he assured her softly. "Go back to sleep." Instead, Lillian pushed herself up to a sitting position, wincing at the stiffness in her back. How long was I asleep? Few hours. Still plenty of night left. Lillian wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of the chill that had settled over the valley. Miles noticed immediately and shrugged out of his coat, crossing to drape it over her shoulders before she could protest. "What about you?" she asked, clutching the warm fabric around herself despite her objection. "I'm used to it," he replied with a slight shrug, returning to his position by the boulder. "Desert nights and all." The coat smelled of leather, horse, and the indefinable scent of open spaces. Lillian pulled it closer, finding unexpected comfort in the lingering warmth. "You should get some sleep too," she said after a moment. "I can keep watch for a while." Miles shook his head. "I'm fine. Been on cattle drives where I got less sleep than this. Besides," he gestured toward her middle. "You're resting for two." Lillian's hand moved automatically to her belly. "He's been restless tonight, kicking up a storm earlier." Miles raised an eyebrow. "Just a feeling," Lillian admitted with a small smile. "My husband always said we'd have a son first." "Your husband," Miles began carefully. "He passed recently?" The simple question threatened to unravel the tight control Lillian had maintained over her emotions for months. She swallowed hard before answering. 8 months ago. Influenza. We'd been married just over a year." She paused, memories washing over her. "Thomas was a schoolteacher. We met when I was assisting in the school where he taught in St. Louis. He was so kind, so gentle, nothing like my father." The last word slipped out unbidden. Lillian pressed her lips together, not having intended to reveal so much. Miles didn't press, simply nodded as if he understood perfectly well what she meant without elaboration. "After he died," Lillian continued after a moment, "there was nothing for me in St. Louis. I discovered I was expecting just after the funeral, Thomas's parents." She hesitated, old pain lancing through her. "They blamed me somehow for his death, for everything. Said I wasn't good enough for their son, wouldn't acknowledge their grandchild." "Fools," Miles said quietly. The simple condemnation of their cruelty brought unexpected tears to Lillian's eyes. She blinked them away, determined not to break down. "I came west because I heard there were opportunities, places where a woman alone might start fresh." She gave a humorless laugh. "I was naive." "Not naive," Miles countered. "Brave. Takes courage to start over." Lillian shook her head. "Look where it got me, running for my life with nothing to my name but the clothes I'm wearing." "You're alive," Miles pointed out. "Your baby's alive. And Vernon Blackstone ain't laying a hand on either of you. I'd call that something worth having." His certainty was like a balm to Lillian's wounded spirit. For the first time in months, she felt the faintest stirring of hope. "What's your plan?" Miles asked after a comfortable silence had stretched between them. "After we get you somewhere safe, I mean," Lillian sighed. "I don't know. Keep moving, I suppose. Find a town big enough that Vernon won't find me. Look for honest work." She placed a protective hand over her belly. "Build a life for my child." "Arizona's a big territory," Miles said thoughtfully. "Plenty of places a man like Blackstone wouldn't think to look." "Do you know of such places?" Lillian asked, hope coloring her voice. Miles nodded slowly. "A few, but we've got time to figure that out." First priority is getting you to my cabin to rest properly. We can talk about what comes next when you've had a decent meal and a real night's sleep." As if on cue, Lillian yawned widely, covering her mouth in embarrassment. Miles smiled. "Try to sleep a bit more. Dawn's still a ways off, and we've got ground to cover tomorrow." Lillian nodded, settling back onto the bedroll, Miles's coat still wrapped around her shoulders. Despite her worries, despite the uncertainty that lay ahead, she felt safer than she had in months. The baby gave a gentle kick, as if in agreement. Her last thought before drifting back to sleep was that perhaps, just perhaps, she had finally found an ally in this harsh new world. The first light of dawn was just beginning to streak the eastern sky when Miles gently shook Lillian awake. She blinked up at him, momentarily confused by the rocky surroundings until the events of the previous day came flooding back. "Sorry to wake you," he said, already moving around the camp, gathering their few belongings. "But we should get moving. Those men might have figured out where we went by now." Lillian sat up quickly, wincing at the stiffness in her back from sleeping on the hard ground. "Of course," she agreed, struggling to her feet. Miles paused in his preparations, watching her with concern. "How are you feeling this morning? Any more of those pains?" "No," Lillian assured him, though in truth her entire body ached from days of flight and poor rest. "I'm fine, just eager to reach somewhere safe." Miles nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "We'll take it slow. My cabin's about 4 hours' ride from here if we keep a steady pace." He offered her a strip of jerky and some hardtack for breakfast, along with water from his canteen. It wasn't much, but Lillian accepted it gratefully, knowing they needed to conserve their limited supplies. As she ate, Miles saddled Penny and scattered the remnants of their fire, carefully obscuring any evidence of their presence. His movements were efficient and practiced, speaking of years spent in the wilderness. "Ready?" he asked when he'd finished, holding his hand out to help her mount. Lillian nodded, allowing him to boost her into the saddle. Miles swung up behind her, his presence solid and reassuring at her back. One arm reached around her to take the reins, careful not to press too closely against her. "There's another passage on the far side of the valley," he explained as they set off. "Not as narrow as the one we came through. It'll lead us down toward the river, then we'll follow that for a spell before cutting across to my place." The morning air was crisp and clear, the sky above them a perfect blue. Under different circumstances, Lillian might have found the scenery breathtaking, the towering red rock formations catching the early sunlight, the scattered juniper and pinyon pines clinging to seemingly impossible perches on the canyon walls. As they rode, Miles pointed out landmarks and shared bits of knowledge about the desert landscape, which plants were edible, where water could be found even in the driest seasons, how to read the weather from the clouds. Lillian listened attentively, grateful for both the information and the distraction from her discomfort and worries. "You know this land well," she observed during a brief pause in his commentary. "Been riding these canyons since I was a boy," Miles confirmed. "My pa was a prospector. Not a very successful one, mind you, but he loved these hills. Taught me everything he knew about surviving out here." "Is your father still?" Lillian let the question hang, unsure how to phrase it delicately. "Passed on 10 years back," Miles replied, his voice matter-of-fact rather than sorrowful. "Cave-in at a mine he was working. Ma followed him 3 years later, just wasted away, really. Missed him something fierce." "I'm sorry," Lillian said softly. Miles shrugged slightly, the movement perceptible against her back. "It's the way of things out here. Life's hard. Makes the good parts all the sweeter, though." They lapsed into comfortable silence, as the horse picked her way carefully down a steep slope toward a ribbon of green that marked the course of the river. The sound of running water reached them before they could see it, a gentle gurgling that promised relief from the growing heat of the day. When they reached the river's edge, Miles helped Lillian dismount, his strong hands gentle at her waist. "Let's rest here a spell," he suggested. "Let Penny drink, refill our canteens." Lillian nodded gratefully, easing herself down onto a flat rock near the water's edge. Her back ached fiercely, and the baby seemed unusually active, as if sensing her discomfort. Miles led the horse to drink, then filled their canteens with the clear, cold water. When he returned to Lillian's side, he frowned at her pale complexion. "You don't look well," he said bluntly. "Those pains come back." "No," Lillian said automatically, then sighed at his skeptical expression. "Maybe, just twinges, nothing serious." Miles's frown deepened. "We should get you to the cabin as quick as we can. My neighbor's wife is a midwife. I can ride for her once we're there." The concern in his voice warmed something in Lillian that had been cold for a very long time. "I'm sure it's nothing," she assured him. "Just the strain of the past few days." Before Miles could respond, a sound carried to them on the breeze, distant but unmistakable. Voices. Male voices, carried by the canyon walls. Miles stiffened, his hand moving automatically to the rifle slung across his back. "Stay here," he ordered quietly, moving to a higher point where he could see back the way they had come. Lillian's heart raced as she watched him scan the horizon, his body language tense and alert. After what seemed an eternity, he returned to her side, his expression grim. "4 riders, about a mile back, following our trail." Fear clutched at Lillian's throat. "Vernon's men, looks that way. Matches the description of the ones I saw chasing you yesterday." Miles was already helping her to her feet, his movements urgent but controlled. "We need to move. Now." He boosted her onto Penny's back and swung up behind her in one fluid motion, spurring the horse toward the water. To Lillian's surprise, instead of crossing the river, Miles guided the mare directly into the current, following its course downstream. "The water will hide our tracks," he explained, sensing her confusion. "We'll follow it as far as we can, then cut across country where the ground's too rocky to hold prints." The horse picked her way carefully through the shallow river, water splashing up to their knees. Lillian clutched the saddle horn, acutely aware of how precarious their position was if Penny slipped or stepped in a hidden hole. They could all be swept away. Miles's arm tightened around her waist, steady and reassuring. "Easy," he murmured, though whether to her or the horse, Lillian wasn't certain. "Just a little further." They followed the river for nearly half an hour, the canyon walls gradually falling away as the landscape opened up into a broader valley. Eventually, Miles guided them out of the water onto a stretch of gravelly shore, then up a steep, rock-strewn slope that would leave minimal tracks. "My place is just beyond that ridge," he said, pointing to a distant line of hills. "Another hour, maybe less if we push." Lillian nodded, too focused on enduring the increasingly frequent twinges of pain to speak. Something wasn't right. The discomfort was coming more regularly now, radiating from her lower back around to her abdomen. But she bit her lip, determined not to slow their escape. Miles pushed Penny harder than before, clearly anxious to reach the safety of his cabin before their pursuers caught up. The landscape blurred around them as they rode, scrubby plains giving way to scattered juniper, and eventually to a small copse of pines that marked the approach to Miles's property. They crested a final rise, and Miles's cabin came into view, a sturdy, well-maintained structure nestled against the hillside, with a small corral for livestock and what appeared to be the beginnings of a garden plot. In any other circumstances, Lillian would have found it charming. As they approached, Miles whistled sharply, 3 short notes followed by a longer one. A moment later, a large dog emerged from behind the cabin, ears perked and alert. "That's Ranger," Miles explained as they drew near. "He'll let us know if anyone approaches." He dismounted quickly when they reached the cabin, helping Lillian down with careful hands. She swayed slightly as her feet touched the ground, a sharp pain making her catch her breath. Miles's arm went around her waist immediately, steadying her. "Let's get you inside," he said, concern evident in his voice. The cabin's interior was simple but surprisingly comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, and a small kitchen area. A doorway at the back presumably led to a bedroom. Everything was neat and clean, with a few personal touches: a bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes, a handmade quilt draped over a rocking chair, a guitar leaning in one corner. "Sit," Miles instructed, guiding Lillian to the rocking chair. "I need to take care of Penny and set Ranger to watch, then I'll fetch Mrs. Cowpersmith from the next homestead." "No," Lillian protested weakly. "Vernon's men might still be searching. I don't want to put anyone else in danger." Miles knelt before her, his expression serious. "Lillian, I'm worried about you and the baby. Those pains, they're coming more regular now, aren't they?" Unable to deny it any longer, Lillian nodded. "But it's too early," she whispered, fear threading through her voice. "The baby's not due for months yet, which is exactly why we need Mrs. Cowpersmith," Miles insisted gently. "She's delivered more babies than anyone in the territory. If anyone can help, it's her." Another pain gripped Lillian, stronger than before, forcing a small gasp from her lips. Miles's face tightened with concern. "I'll be quick," he promised, rising to his feet. "There's water in the pitcher there and food in the pantry if you're hungry. Bolt the door behind me. I'll knock 3 times when I return." Despite her misgivings, Lillian couldn't deny that she needed help. She nodded reluctantly. Miles hesitated at the door, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "You'll be safe here," he assured her softly. "I promise." After he left, Lillian managed to rise from the chair long enough to slide the bolt across the door. The simple action depleted what little energy she had remaining. She sank back into the rocking chair, one hand cradling her belly as another pain began building. "Not yet, little one," she pleaded quietly. "It's not time yet. Please hold on." But as the minutes ticked by, marked only by the steady creak of the rocking chair and Lillian's increasingly labored breathing, she began to accept that the baby might have other plans. The pains were coming regularly now, each stronger than the last. Gathering her strength, Lillian made her way to the bedroom, thinking she would be better off lying down. The room was small but neat, with a narrow bed covered in another handmade quilt and a chest of drawers topped with a basin and pitcher. The window offered a view of the surrounding hills, painted gold and crimson in the late afternoon light. Lillian eased herself onto the bed, arranging the pillows to support her back. Another pain seized her, more intense than any before, and she couldn't suppress a cry of distress. When it passed, she found herself trembling, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she whispered, unsure if she was addressing the baby, God, or merely the uncaring universe. "Please let us survive this." As if in answer, she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching, followed by Ranger's alert barking. Lillian tensed, fear coursing through her. Had Vernon's men found them already? Was Miles returning so soon? The dog's barking changed from alert to welcoming, suggesting it was indeed Miles returning. Lillian relaxed slightly, only to be seized by another pain that drove all other thoughts from her mind. 3 sharp knocks sounded at the door, followed by Miles's voice. "Lillian, it's me. I've brought Mrs. Cowpersmith." Unable to rise to unbolt the door, Lillian called out weakly, It's unlocked. The door opened to admit Miles, followed by a stout, gray-haired woman carrying a large basket. The midwife took one look at Lillian's face and turned to Miles. "Fetch water and heat it on the stove," she ordered briskly. "Then make yourself scarce. This is women's business now." Miles nodded, casting one worried glance at Lillian before hurrying to obey. Mrs. Cowpersmith approached the bed, her weathered face kind but serious as she set her basket down. "Now then, Mrs. Warren," she said, placing a cool hand on Lillian's forehead. "Miles tells me you're having pains. Let's have a look at what's happening." The next hours passed in a blur of pain for Lillian. Mrs. Cowpersmith confirmed what she had already suspected: the baby was coming, far too early, and there was nothing they could do to stop it now. All they could hope for was a safe delivery and a strong enough child to survive its premature arrival. Through it all, Miles remained just outside the bedroom door, a steady presence even when Lillian's cries reached their most desperate pitch. Occasionally, Mrs. Cowpersmith would call for fresh water or clean linens, and he would appear silently, providing what was needed before withdrawing again. As the sun set and the cabin grew dark except for the glow of lanterns, Lillian's strength began to wane. The contractions were coming fast now, each one seemingly more impossible to bear than the last. Mrs. Cowpersmith's face grew increasingly concerned as she checked the baby's position. "Mrs. Warren," she said gently during a brief respite between pains, "I need to speak plainly. The baby is small as we expected, but it's also not positioned quite right. I'm going to try to turn it, but it's going to hurt something fierce." Lillian nodded weakly, too exhausted to speak. She had come too far, endured too much to lose her child now. "Miles," Mrs. Cowpersmith called, "I need your help in here." Miles appeared in the doorway, his face drawn with concern. "What do you need?" "Hold her shoulders," the midwife instructed. "Keep her steady, this won't be easy." Miles moved to the head of the bed, placing his strong hands on Lillian's shoulders. His eyes met hers, full of a quiet determination that somehow gave her strength. "You can do this," he said softly. "You're the strongest woman I've ever met, Lillian Warren. You and your baby are going to be just fine." The confidence in his voice gave Lillian something to cling to as Mrs. Cowpersmith began the painful process of turning the baby. She screamed once, the agony beyond anything she could have imagined, then bit down hard on her lip, tasting blood. Miles held her steady, murmuring encouragement as tears streamed down her face. His hands were warm and solid on her shoulders, anchoring her to consciousness when the pain threatened to pull her under. "That's it," Mrs. Cowpersmith announced finally. "Baby's turned. Now when the next pain comes, Mrs. Warren, I need you to push with everything you've got." Lillian gathered her remaining strength, fixing her gaze on Miles's face as another contraction built. His eyes never left hers, steady and sure as a lighthouse in a storm. "Push," Mrs. Cowpersmith commanded. Lillian pushed, a primal sound tearing from her throat as she gave everything she had left to bring her child into the world. "Again," the midwife urged when the contraction eased. "Baby's coming now. One more good push should do it." Miles squeezed Lillian's shoulders gently. "You can do this," he whispered. "Just one more." Drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, Lillian bore down with the next contraction, pushing until she thought her body would tear apart. And then, suddenly, the pressure eased and a tiny, indignant cry filled the room. "It's a boy," Mrs. Cowpersmith announced, her voice thick with emotion. "Small, but he's got a good set of lungs on him." Tears of exhaustion and joy streamed down Lillian's face as the midwife placed the tiny, red-faced infant on her chest. He was impossibly small, wrinkled and angry at his abrupt entrance into the world, but perfect in every way that mattered. "Thomas," Lillian whispered, naming her son for the father he would never know. "Hello, my darling boy." She looked up to find Miles watching them, an expression of wonder on his face. "He's beautiful," he said softly, "strong like his mother." Mrs. Cowpersmith bustled around them, cleaning up and checking both mother and baby. "He's early, no doubt about that," she said pragmatically. "But he's breathing well and he's got good color. We'll need to keep him warm and make sure he feeds regularly, but I've seen smaller babies thrive." The reassurance washed over Lillian like a balm. Her son would live. After everything, the loss of Thomas, the flight from Vernon, the dangerous journey through the canyon, her baby would live. As if sensing her thoughts, Miles placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Rest now," he said softly. "You're both safe here, I promise you that." In the warm glow of the lantern light, cradling her newborn son and surrounded by people who had risked their own safety to help her, Lillian allowed herself to believe him. The first week after Thomas's birth passed in a haze of exhaustion and wonder for Lillian. Despite his early arrival, the baby proved remarkably resilient, nursing eagerly and growing stronger by the day. Mrs. Cowpersmith visited daily, checking on both mother and child, bringing supplies and offering the practical advice of a woman who had helped bring dozens of babies into the world. Miles proved to be an unexpectedly thoughtful host, ensuring Lillian had everything she needed without intruding on her privacy. He took over the daily chores of the homestead, cared for the livestock, and even managed to bring in fresh game for their meals. At night, he slept in the main room, giving Lillian and the baby the bedroom. On the 8th day after Thomas's birth, Lillian woke to the sound of quiet conversation in the main room. Carefully setting the sleeping baby in the center of the bed surrounded by pillows to prevent him from rolling, she rose and dressed, curious about their visitor. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Miles seated at the table with a weathered-looking man in the dusty clothes of a ranch hand. Both men rose at her appearance. "Lillian," Miles said, a hint of tension in his voice, "this is Sam Doyle. He works at the livery in Holbrook." The man nodded respectfully. "Madam." "Sam's brought news," Miles continued, gesturing for her to take a seat, "about Vernon Blackstone." Fear clutched at Lillian's heart as she sank into the offered chair. "Has he found us?" "No, madam," Sam assured her quickly. "Quite the opposite. Vernon Blackstone's dead." Lillian blinked, certain she had misheard. "Dead?" Sam nodded, twisting his hat in his hands. "Shot during a dispute at his saloon 3 days ago. One of his own men did it, from what I heard. Some argument over payment." A strange numbness spread through Lillian as she processed the news. Vernon, the man who had terrorized her, whose threats had driven her to flee into the wilderness while heavily pregnant, was gone. Just like that, the danger had evaporated. "His men?" she asked, finding her voice. "The ones who were chasing me, scattered to the winds," Sam replied. "Without Blackstone to pay them, they've got no reason to pursue you. Most were hired guns with no personal stake in the matter." Miles watched her carefully, gauging her reaction. "You're safe now, Lillian. You and Thomas both." The realization washed over her like a wave. She was free. Truly free for the first time since Thomas's death. No longer hunted, no longer running. She could build a life for herself and her son without looking over her shoulder. Tears welled in her eyes, and she covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed by the sudden release of tension she had been carrying for so long. She felt a gentle hand on her shoulder and looked up to find Miles beside her, concern etched on his features. "Are you all right?" Lillian nodded, wiping her tears away. "Yes, just relieved and grateful, to you especially." She turned to include Sam in her gratitude. "And to you for bringing the news." Sam ducked his head modestly. "Least I could do. Miles here saved my life once during a blizzard." I owe him more than a bit of news carrying." After Sam departed, promising to return in a few days with supplies from town, Lillian stood by the window watching his retreating figure, lost in thought. "What will you do now?" Miles asked quietly from behind her. It was the question Lillian had been asking herself since hearing the news of Vernon's death. The future, which had seemed so constrained just hours ago, now stretched before her with possibilities. "I don't know," she admitted, turning to face him. "I have a little money saved from before everything happened. Not much, but perhaps enough to start over somewhere." Miles nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "You could go to Prescott, maybe. It's a decent-sized town, or Phoenix. Both have schools that might need a teacher's assistant like you were before." "Yes," Lillian agreed, though the prospect didn't fill her with the relief or excitement she might have expected. "That would be sensible." A cry from the bedroom announced that Thomas was awake and hungry. Lillian moved to tend to him, grateful for the momentary reprieve from decisions that suddenly seemed too weighty to make. When she returned to the main room with Thomas cradled in her arms, Miles was stoking the fire, his back to her. The morning light caught the copper highlights in his dark hair, and Lillian found herself studying the strong line of his shoulders, the capable hands that had guided her to safety, that had helped bring her son into the world. "Miles," she said softly. He turned, his expression softening at the sight of mother and child. "He's looking stronger already," he observed, crossing to them. "Got more color in his cheeks. Would you like to hold him?" Lillian offered impulsively. Surprise flickered across Miles's face, followed by something like longing. "I don't want to hurt him. He's so small." "You won't hurt him," Lillian assured him, carefully transferring the tiny bundle to his arms. "Support his head like this." Miles cradled Thomas with unexpected tenderness, his large hands gentle as they held the infant. The baby blinked up at him, tiny fists waving in the air. "Hello, little man," Miles murmured, a smile transforming his weathered features. "You're a fighter, aren't you? Just like your ma." Something warm unfurled in Lillian's chest as she watched them together. This man, who had risked his life for strangers, who had opened his home to them without question, who now held her son with such care he was unlike anyone she had ever known. "I never properly thanked you," she said softly. "For everything you've done for us." Miles looked up from the baby, his eyes meeting hers. "No thanks needed. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Lillian contradicted gently. "They wouldn't have. What you did finding me in that canyon, bringing us here, helping deliver Thomas, it was extraordinary, Miles." A flush crept up his neck, and he looked back down at the baby, clearly uncomfortable with her praise. "Just did what needed doing is all." Thomas began to fuss, and Miles handed him back to Lillian with obvious reluctance. As their hands brushed during the transfer, a jolt of awareness passed between them, startling in its intensity. For a moment they stood too close, the baby cradled between them, the air suddenly charged with something neither was prepared to name. Miles stepped back first, clearing his throat. "I should check on the livestock," he said, moving toward the door. "Let you have some privacy with the little one." After he left, Lillian sank into the rocking chair, her heart beating too quickly. What was happening to her? This warmth, this awareness of Miles as more than her rescuer, it was unexpected and confusing. Her husband had been gone less than a year. She had just given birth. This was hardly the time for such feelings. And yet, as she rocked Thomas and gazed out the window at Miles tending to his small herd of cattle, she couldn't deny that something had shifted between them, or perhaps within her. A recognition of possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to consider. That evening, as they shared a simple supper of rabbit stew and cornbread, Lillian found herself watching Miles when he wasn't looking, noticing the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled. The careful precision with which he did everything from cutting bread to stoking the fire. The quiet consideration he showed by ensuring her plate was always full and her cup never empty. "Tell me about your place here," she invited as they lingered over coffee after the meal. "How long have you had it?" Miles seemed surprised by her interest but pleased. "Going on 5 years now. Saved every penny I earned at the Triple Crown to buy the land. Built the cabin myself with some help from neighbors. It's lovely," Lillian said sincerely. "You've done well with it." "It's not much," Miles demurred, though pride was evident in his voice. "But it's mine. Got 12 head of cattle now, a good vegetable garden started. Hoping to expand a bit more each year." "You plan to stay here? Make this your permanent home?" Miles nodded, gazing around the cabin with obvious satisfaction. "Can't imagine being anywhere else. This land gets into your blood, you know, the open spaces, the changing light on the hills. Even the harshness of it has its own beauty." His words resonated with something in Lillian that she hadn't realized. Was there a growing appreciation for this wild, demanding country that had nearly killed her, but had also offered refuge when she needed it most? "I think I'm beginning to understand that," she admitted. Miles studied her face, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said carefully, "there's no rush for you to leave. Not until you're fully recovered and the baby's stronger. You're welcome to stay as long as you need." The offer warmed Lillian more than it should have. "That's very generous, but I couldn't impose. It's no imposition," Miles interrupted gently. "I've got the space and He hesitated, then continued more softly. "I've enjoyed having you and Thomas here. The cabin feels more like a home with you in it." The simple admission hung in the air between them, charged with meaning neither was quite ready to articulate. "Thank you," Lillian said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll stay, then, for a little while." A little while stretched into weeks, and weeks into a month. Thomas grew stronger daily, his tiny features becoming more defined, his cries more insistent. Lillian regained her strength, gradually taking on more of the household tasks, finding unexpected satisfaction in the rhythms of life on the homestead. Miles taught her practical skills: how to tend the vegetable garden, how to recognize the signs of approaching weather changes, how to use the rifle he kept by the door, just in case. In return, Lillian shared her knowledge of books and numbers, reading aloud in the evenings from his small collection of volumes while he worked on repairing tack or carving simple wooden toys for Thomas. They fell into a comfortable routine, their lives intertwining in 100 small ways. Miles would rock Thomas to sleep when Lillian was exhausted. Lillian would have coffee waiting when Miles came in from his early morning chores. They shared meals and stories and quiet evenings by the fire, building a foundation of friendship and mutual respect that grew stronger with each passing day. Neither spoke of the future, or of Lillian's eventual departure. It became an unmentioned possibility that receded further into the distance as their days together accumulated, each one adding another thread to the fabric of their shared life. And if their hands sometimes lingered when passing the coffee pot, if their gazes held a moment longer than necessary across the dinner table, if the space between them seemed to crackle with unspoken possibilities, well, neither was quite ready to acknowledge what was happening. Until the storm came. It began as a distant rumble of thunder one afternoon in late summer, a sound that made Miles frown as he and Lillian worked in the garden. "That doesn't sound right," he murmured, straightening to scan the horizon. Lillian followed his gaze to where dark clouds were building in the west, moving toward them with unnatural speed. "A thunderstorm. More than that," Miles said grimly. Flash flood weather. We need to get everything secured." The next hours were a flurry of activity as they prepared for the approaching storm. Miles moved the livestock to higher ground, while Lillian gathered anything that might blow away, checking that the cabin's roof was secure and the shutters fastened. By the time the first fat raindrops began to fall, they had done all they could to prepare. Thomas slept peacefully in his cradle, a beautiful piece Miles had carved during the long evenings of Lillian's recovery, seemingly undisturbed by the growing commotion outside. "It's going to be a bad one," Miles predicted, watching the rain intensify from the cabin's doorway. "The canyon will flood for sure. Good thing we're not down there now." The thought sent a shiver through Lillian. If Miles hadn't found her when he did, if they had still been traveling when this storm hit. As if reading her thoughts, Miles placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're safe," he reminded her. "Both of you." The storm intensified as night fell, rain lashing at the cabin windows, wind howling around the eaves. Occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the room in stark white light, followed by crashes of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small structure. Thomas woke crying, frightened by the noise. Lillian paced the floor with him, trying to soothe his distress while battling her own unease. She had never experienced a storm of this magnitude, and despite Miles's calm assurances, she couldn't help but worry about the cabin's ability to withstand such an onslaught. "Here," Miles said, holding out his arms. "Let me take him for a bit. You should rest." Gratefully, Lillian transferred the fussing baby to Miles's capable hands. To her surprise, Thomas quieted almost immediately, his cries subsiding to hiccuping sobs as Miles walked with him, murmuring softly. "He likes you," Lillian observed, sinking into the rocking chair. "We understand each other, don't we, little man?" Miles replied, smiling down at the baby. "Both of us know a good thing when we see it." The simple comment, delivered without looking at her, made Lillian's heart skip a beat. Before she could respond, a particularly violent gust of wind hit the cabin, rattling the shutters ominously. Miles frowned, handing Thomas back to her. "I need to check outside, make sure everything's secure." "Is that safe?" Lillian asked, alarmed. "I'll be careful," he promised, already pulling on his oilskin coat. "Keep away from the windows, just in case." Before she could protest further, he was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. Lillian clutched Thomas closer, anxiety gnawing at her as the minutes stretched on with no sign of Miles's return. When the door finally burst open again, Miles staggered in, soaked to the skin and breathing hard. "The creek's rising," he reported grimly, shrugging out of his dripping coat. "Faster than I've ever seen. We might need to move to higher ground if it keeps up." Lillian's fear must have shown on her face because Miles crossed to her immediately, placing reassuring hands on her shoulders. "Don't worry," he said firmly. "I won't let anything happen to you or Thomas. We've got time yet, and the cabin's built solid. I'm just being cautious." He was standing very close, water dripping from his hair onto his shirt, his eyes intent on her face. Lillian was suddenly acutely aware of his hands on her shoulders, warm and strong through the fabric of her dress. "I know you'll keep us safe," she said softly. "You always have." Something shifted in Miles's expression, a softening, a moment of vulnerability that made him look younger, less weathered by the harsh life he had led. "Lillian," he began, his voice rough with emotion. A tremendous crash interrupted whatever he had been about to say. Both of them jumped, and Thomas began wailing again, startled by the noise. "That sounded close," Lillian said, her heart pounding. Miles nodded grimly. "Too close. Stay here while I check." This time when he went outside, he returned almost immediately, his expression troubled. Lightning hit a tree near the corral, It's fallen across the path to higher ground." "What does that mean?" Lillian asked, trying to keep her voice steady for Thomas's sake. "It means if we need to evacuate, we'll have to find another route." Miles ran a hand through his wet hair, thinking. "There's a path that leads up behind the cabin, but it's steep, not easy in the dark, especially with a baby." "But the cabin is safe," Lillian pressed. Miles hesitated just long enough to send a fresh wave of fear through her. "It should hold," he said finally. "We're on relatively high ground here, but I've seen these flash floods before. They're unpredictable." As if to underscore his point, a new sound joined the cacophony of the storm, a distant roaring that seemed to grow louder by the moment. Miles's head snapped up, his expression suddenly alert. "That's the creek breaking its banks," he said tensely. "We need to move. Now." The next moments were a blur of urgent activity. Miles gathered essential supplies while Lillian bundled Thomas securely against her chest. Outside, the rain had eased slightly, but the roaring sound had grown louder, an ominous backdrop to their hasty preparations. "Stay close to me," Miles instructed as they left the cabin, a lantern held high to illuminate their path. The trails narrow in places. The path behind the cabin zigzagged up the hillside, muddy and treacherous in the storm's aftermath. Lillian followed Miles as closely as she could, one arm supporting Thomas, the other often reaching out to steady herself against the slick rocks. They had climbed perhaps halfway up the hill when a tremendous crack split the night, followed by the unmistakable sound of rushing water. Miles whirled, the lantern light revealing his stricken expression as he looked back toward the cabin. In the valley below, illuminated by occasional flashes of lightning, a wall of water surged through where the creek had been, swollen to many times its normal size. As they watched in horror, it reached the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood. "Miles." Lillian breathed, clutching Thomas tighter. "Keep moving," he urged, his voice tight. "We need to get higher." They pressed on, the path growing steeper and more challenging. Twice Lillian slipped, saved from falling only by Miles's quick reflexes as he caught her arm. Thomas, miraculously, remained quiet throughout the ordeal, as if sensing the need for silence. Finally, they reached a small plateau near the top of the hill, sheltered somewhat by an overhang of rock. Miles set down the lantern and the pack of supplies, helping Lillian to a seated position on a relatively dry patch of ground. "We'll wait out the worst of it here," he said, settling beside her. "Come morning, we can assess the damage." Exhausted and chilled, Lillian leaned against his solid warmth, Thomas cradled between them. Miles wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her closer. "I'm sorry about the cabin," she said softly, knowing how much it meant to him. Miles shook his head. "It's just a building. You and Thomas are what matter." The simple declaration, delivered without hesitation, brought tears to Lillian's eyes. "We would have died if not for you. Again." "Don't think about that," Miles murmured, his hand rubbing gentle circles on her back. "You're safe now, both of you." They sat in silence for a time, listening to the storm gradually diminish, the roar of floodwaters receding as the creek returned to its banks. Thomas dozed against Lillian's chest, remarkably peaceful given the circumstances. "He's a remarkable baby," Miles observed, gently stroking a finger across the infant's cheek. "Strong and brave like his mother." Lillian looked up at him, finding his face much closer than she had realized. In the lantern's glow, his eyes were dark and intense, fixed on her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Miles," she whispered, suddenly unable to say more. "I know it's too soon," he said quietly. "I know you're still grieving your husband, still finding your way, but Lillian—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "These past weeks with you and Thomas, they've been the best of my life." Lillian's heart raced, hope and fear warring within her. "Mine too," she admitted softly. Miles's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. "I don't want them to end." The words hung between them, a question and a promise wrapped in one. Lillian leaned into his touch, allowing herself to acknowledge what she had been feeling for weeks now. "Neither do I," she whispered. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the lantern light casting soft shadows across their faces. Then, with exquisite slowness, Miles leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so tender it brought fresh tears to Lillian's eyes. When they parted, Miles rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "I think I've been falling in love with you since I first saw you in that canyon," he confessed. "So brave, so determined to protect your child. And I think I began falling in love with you when you risked everything to help a stranger," Lillian replied, her voice thick with emotion. "When you guided us through the only safe path." Miles smiled, the expression transforming his features. "I'll always find a safe path for you," he promised. "For both of you." As dawn broke over the hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they made their way carefully down to assess the damage. The cabin, built on slightly higher ground than it had appeared from above, had survived the flood relatively intact. Water had entered, leaving mud and debris in its wake, but the structure itself was sound. "It'll take some cleaning," Miles observed as they stood in the doorway, "but we can make it right again." Lillian looked at him, this man who had saved her life multiple times, who had helped bring her son into the world, who had offered his heart to her without reservation. "Yes," she agreed softly, reaching for his hand. "Together we can make it right." 6 months later, on a crisp autumn day with the hills ablaze in colors of red and gold, Lillian Warren became Lillian Fletcher in a small ceremony at the Holbrook Church. Thomas, now thriving and beginning to pull himself up on furniture, watched from Mrs. Cowpersmith's arms, occasionally babbling his approval. Their cabin, restored and expanded with the help of neighbors, stood ready to welcome them home, a home built on courage, kindness, and a love that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances. And as Miles led his new family across the threshold, Lillian remembered the desperate woman who had fled through Rattlesnake Canyon alone, pregnant and terrified. How far she had come since then, guided by a cowboy who had shown her the only safe path not just through the canyon, but to a future brighter than she could have imagined. "Welcome home," Miles whispered, his arm secure around her waist. Lillian looked up at him, at this man who had become her shelter in the storm, her partner in all things. "I am home," she replied softly. "Wherever you are, that's my home now." As the years passed, the Fletcher homestead flourished, growing from a modest cabin to a prosperous small ranch. Thomas grew into a strong, thoughtful boy with his mother's determination and his stepfather's quiet confidence. He was joined 2 years after Miles and Lillian's wedding by a sister, Emma, whose arrival was considerably less dramatic than her brother's but no less joyful. Miles expanded his cattle operation, eventually purchasing the neighboring property when the Cowpersmiths decided to move closer to their daughter in Prescott. Lillian, drawing on her earlier training, started a small school for the children of nearby homesteaders, teaching in a one-room schoolhouse Miles built for her as a 5th anniversary present. They never forgot how their story began with a desperate flight through a canyon, and the courage of 2 strangers to trust when trust seemed impossible. Each year on the anniversary of their meeting, Miles and Lillian would ride to a certain viewpoint overlooking Rattlesnake Canyon, watching the sunset paint the rocks the same blood-red shade they had been on that fateful day. "I was so afraid," Lillian would sometimes say, leaning against her husband's solid strength. I never imagined that running for my life would lead me to everything I ever wanted. And Miles would kiss her temple gently, his arm secure around her waist. "Sometimes the hardest paths lead to the best destinations," he would reply. "And I'll always be grateful that yours led to me." In time, their story became something of a legend in Hallbrook and the surrounding homesteads, the tale of a pregnant woman fleeing through the canyon alone, and the cowboy who led her through the only safe path. A path that led not just to safety, but to a love that would endure through all the seasons of their lives.